So now, officially, hello everybody. I am very pleased I could present, or I could invite today to our lecture series Professor Peter Simons, who is a great expert in philosophy of on the Warsaw School and also continuator of the tradition of the Warsaw School. Before I officially introduce the lecturer, I just want to mention that this lecture series is sponsored by Visegrad Fund, to whom we are really grateful. And this is the fifth of the 9 lectures that will be on analytic philosophy in Visegrad countries, which is the title of our subject. One of the participants in the audience, Anna Broszek, will also present this semester her lecture. So if you are interested in philosophy of the Warsaw School, you could also join us later. But now I would like to introduce Professor Peter Simons, who kindly agreed to give us a lecture on the concept of true in the Warsaw School. As I already told you, he is a continuator of the tradition of the Warsaw School because he's actually a student of one of the members of the Warsaw School, Leśniewski, but he also developed ideas from certain members of the Warsaw School, most famously Stanisław Leśniewski, and he's also original philosopher, and he's so famous that I suppose that he don't need an introduction. But if you want to go deeply into the topic of the Warsaw School, you probably bumped into several of his papers, books, or even entries in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. So without more ado, I'm very pleased to have Professor Simons with us. And please, Peter, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Zuzanna. Thank you very much for the invitation. It's a great pleasure to be here, being able to talk to you without the trouble of going through airports and so on. Some things have come out well after the pandemic, and virtual conferences, I think, is one of them. It's not a substitute, but it's better than nothing. That's my topic. I have a few slides. I have about 20 slides, which are mainly there in order to back up things that I'm saying. But I'm actually going to read my paper because I have written it. And I will put relevant slides up as we come to them. So I have a little motto, which is this. It's in Polish. Zdanie prawdziwe jest to zdanie, które wyraża, że tak rzeczy się mają I rzeczy mają się tak właśnie, which I'm not going to translate now because I translate it later on. It's actually a quotation from Alfred Tarski, although probably the impetus for him to use this particular piece of this particular sentence probably came from his teacher, Kotarbiński. We'll come on to that. So the contents, most of the sections are quite short. So there's a short introduction on Tarski's big paper of 1933. 2 sections on background, very short. Background 1, Aristotle. Background 2, Brentano. Then I will talk about Twardowski and the idea of absolute truth. I will then talk about Łukasiewicz's anti-psychologism and the debate about free will and the future, the truth value of sentences about the contingent future. Obviously, this is a topic going back to Aristotle and was a live subject in the school. I should just call the Lvov-Warsaw School, I'll just call the school. It was a live subject in the school before the First World War, during the First World War, and after the First World War. And those 3 gentlemen listed there are the primary discussants in this dialogue, or trialogue in that case. Łukasiewicz on introducing additional truth values. Then something about Leśniewski, the shift in his view on the basic formal and truth conditions of elementary sentences, which I've called From Mill to Occam. You'll see why. Something about Leśniewski on antinomies and their avoidance, how to avoid antinomies. Then we come to Tarski, who is really the the prime object of this discussion, how Tarski avoids antinomies to do with the concept of truth, his so-called convention T, which I shall have something to say about, which is, despite what some commentators would have you believe, is not his theory of truth. It's a condition on a theory of truth. I will talk then about how Tarski's influence, very briefly, because it's a huge subject, very briefly on how Tarski's influence flourished after World War II, not immediately perhaps, but certainly over a long period, right up until the end of the century. In fact, there are still papers coming out all the time about Tarski's theory of truth and what to do with it, whether to accept it or reject it, and so forth. And then a little bit more about Łukasiewicz on many-valued logic, which is his post-war ideas on that, written when he was in my old town of Dublin. And after the war, obviously, when he'd emigrated. And then finally, a little plug for some of my own ideas based on what's gone before. So we start with Tarski. It's generally accepted among those who think about these things that the most important and most widely influential single piece of writing to come out of the school is Alfred Tarski's 1933 monograph, Pojęcie, prawdy, językach, nauk, dedukcyjnych, especially after it became available in German in 1935 in a revised and extended form with a revised title, Der Wahrheitsbegriff in den formalisierten, that's a misprint, it should be in den formalisierten Sprachen. And still further in 1956, when for monoglots, it was published in English translation as The Concept of Truth in Formalized Languages, translated by a biologist, Joseph Henry Woodger. Now, the influence is not a matter of opinion, it's a matter of statistics. I tried to do the statistics, but I'm confident that this is probably the single most discussed piece of writing to have come out of the school, überhaupt. But the work by Tarski didn't arise in a vacuum. Philosophers and logicians in the school from Twardowski onwards laid great stress on truth as a central topic in logic and philosophy. And their discussions have roots going far back in the history of philosophy. I'll just mention those briefly. The primary aim of this talk is to trace the discussion in the school. I will also comment at the end on subsequent developments and on the suitability or otherwise of Tarski's work as an explication of the pre-analytic notion of truth. So background one is Aristotle. All members of the school agreed on a broadly realistic account of truth, having its roots in that dictum of Aristotle, this is the English translation, of course, to say of what is that it is not, or of what is not that it is false, while to say of what is that it is, or of what is not that it is not is true. And underneath you've got the standard or a standard translation of that into Polish. So without going into detail of Aristotle or Aristotelian exegesis, which is not the point here, I'm just going to call this the broad correspondence conception of truth. In a previous paper, Jan Wolensky and I called it weak correspondence, but I quite like the expression broad correspondence. All I will say is that the is here, what is not what a copula. It's and it's certainly not an existential predicate true of objects. It's what the linguists call the factive is, and that's something that ancient Greek had that modern English and most other European languages do not have. So when you say something is in the factive sense, you're meaning it is the case. So the nearest way you can get to it in English is something like is the case or is thus. So one of the things you might say if you were saying it in German would be das ist der Fall, that is the case. And you find that in Wittgenstein. Now, so as a result then, Aristotle's description is not confined, as the English wording might suggest, merely to existential statements. All members of the school agreed with this view in spirit, and in several cases quote this passage exactly. There are in the school, as far as I know, no adherents of idealist or coherentist or pragmatist views, such as one may find elsewhere at this time. The second bit of background is Brentano, and I haven't got a slide about him. One notable interpreter of Aristotle in the late 19th century was Franz Brentano. Brentano's views on truth shifted across his career, but one feature remained constant throughout, and this was his rejection, contrary to the tradition, of subject-predicate as the basic form of judgment. For him, the basic form is that of affirmation or denial of existence. So sentences like, there are human beings, there are no centaurs, would be examples. In his late reistic phase, these judgments simply involve accepting or rejecting what Brentano calls things, Dinge. That there are only things is a position later developed independently of Brentano by Kotarbiński. In his middle period, Brentano took the view that judgments have their own kinds of content. He called them Urteilsinhalte, judgment contents. This view was popular among his German and Austrian students, Marti, Stumpf, Meinong, Husserl, under various names, the most widely accepted being Sachverhalte, states of affairs. But this is a category that was not widely adopted in the Lvov-Warsaw School. An exception would be Ingarden, for example. Brentano's mature account of truth is not broad correspondence, it's epistemic. He says that some judgments are evidently true or evidently false. For example, the judgment that no cats are not cats is evidently true. And it's contradictory, some cats are not cats is evidently false. A judgment then is true or false if one who judged that sentence with evidence would judge it to be true or false. And this is an epistemic theory, it's not a broad correspondence theory. Brentano is famous for reviving the Aristotelian scholastic concept of the intentionality of the mental, and this was adhered to with variations by all his students, most importantly for our purposes by his last great student, who does have a slide to himself, and that's Kazimierz Twardowski. Twardowski was the fons et origo of the school. Before being appointed in Lvov in 1895, he had argued persuasively in his Vienna Habilitationsschrift of 1894 zur Lehre vom Inhalt und Gegenstand der Vorstellungen that intentionality for ideas consists in their having both a content, which is something mental, and a distinct object. Hello? Somebody's microphone is not muted. Having a content which is something mental and a distinct object which typically need not be mental, and indeed in some cases, according to Twardowski, need not exist at all. On the objects of judgment, Twardowski doesn't follow Stumpf, Husserl and co. in postulating a new category of states of affairs, but echoes Occam and other earlier philosophers in taking the object of judgment to be the subject of the relevant judgment. For truth itself, Twardowski adheres to a broad correspondence conception, according to which a judgment is true, which holds that things are thus and so, and things indeed are thus and so. This relatively plain understanding is not the main reason why Twardowski on truth is crucial for the later history of the concept in the school, and that lies elsewhere, and that's what this slide is about. In 1900, Twardowski published, fairly obscurely, an article entitled O tak zwanych prawdach względnych, which means on so-called relative truths. In it, he argued that no judgment that is true relative to or dependent on anything else, but is true absolutely at all times, in all places, and in all circumstances. And this applies mutatis mutandis to false judgments. Some of Twardowski's arguments are relatively commonplace, for example, that naked generalizations, unrestricted ethical rules, statements about taste and the like are not exact, and so in some ways of being made precise are true and in others false. But his most important and original argument is central. Consider my present judgment. Well, let's say it's my present utterance. It is raining. This appears to be relative to circumstance because it may be true here and now, but is not true at other times or places. Twardowski argues against this on two counts. Firstly, the sentence, "it is raining," is adapted specially for rapid and efficient communication. But secondly, as a result, the mere form of words fails to adequately capture or convey the full content of the judgment, or in the case of an utterance, what is stated or expressed by the utterance. Adapting his 1900 example to the present, this context would be adequately expressed rather by the sentence on your screen, which goes, on the 12th of February 2026 at 15:16 UTC, it is raining in Arundel, West Sussex, England, on Arundel Cathedral and its surroundings. The cathedral is 200 meters behind me. As it happens, that utterance, and if I judged it sincerely, that judgment will be false, because for once it's not raining. Amazing. Twardowski's point is that the judgment's content, unlike the meaning of the original sentence, is complete and contextually invariant. Thus, in its primary application, truth and falsity are absolute. Now, I completely agree with Twardowski's conclusion, but not with his reasons, and I'll explain at the end why. What matters for us, however, is that Twardowski's view was almost universally accepted in the school, and this had ramifying consequences for the treatment of truth in that school. Now, next section is about Łukasiewicz, and that's not got a slide to itself. This is Łukasiewicz's anti-psychologism. Twardowski's first major pupil was Jan Łukasiewicz, who more than anyone else was responsible for bringing modern Frege-Russell mathematical logic into the school. Truth is, of course, a key concept for logic. A logically valid inference or argument is by definition one in which, if the premises be true, the conclusion cannot fail to be true. Twardowski, though not himself aspiring to be a logician, gave courses in Lvov detailing the reforms in logic brought in the 19th century by Boole, Jevons, Brentano, and others. Through these, it was made clear to his first generation of students that logic, far from being a completed science, as Kant had claimed, was capable of undergoing improvement and reform. Łukasiewicz had read Husserl's logical investigations and was convinced by its arguments that logic is an autonomous discipline not subordinate to psychology as it had been for much of the 19th century. To emphasize this, Łukasiewicz abandoned the idea that the primary bearers of truth and falsity are judgments, which are mental, in favor of sentences or statements. He accordingly replaced Twardowski's term "sąd," judgment, by the term "zdania," sentence. This terminological and ideological shift to anti-psychologism was adopted by the majority of the school, including all the prominent logicians, although not by Twardowski himself. I shall argue again at the end that although this shift had beneficial effects for the development of logic in the school, philosophically, it was a mistake. The next section is called Free Will and the Future, Kotarbiński, Leśniewski, Łukasiewicz. Łukasiewicz received a study grant to spend time at Graz in Austria. This was 1908, where he interacted with the leader of the Graz school, Alexius Meinong. Meinong was developing under the initial influence of Twardowski his famous theory of objects outside being. While in Graz, Łukasiewicz, simultaneously with Meinong and Meinong's student Ernst Mally, was working on the logic of probability, and this influenced his later thinking on truth, as we'll see. Łukasiewicz had also absorbed influences from Bolzano, perhaps via Twardowski, as well as Frege and Russell. From Frege, he took the terminology of truth values, initially applying them in a non-Fregean way in his theory of probability. From Russell, he learned about logico-mathematical paradoxes, such as Russell's set-theoretic paradox and the older riddle of the liar. The latter paradox threatens to completely undermine the concept of truth and would have significant consequences within the school. Meinong and his students were willing to question the validity of hallowed principles of logic, such as the principles of contradiction and of excluded middle. Łukasiewicz was sympathetic to their openness and considered, initially unsuccessfully, developing what he called a non-Aristotelian logic. The proximate impetus to his breakthrough came from considerations about the truth of predictions. Aristotle had famously considered in De Interpretatione whether a prediction of a future event, such as the occurrence of a sea battle on the morrow, was true or false in advance of the events occurring or not occurring. This fueled a medieval debate about whether God's foreknowledge of the future, implicit in his omniscience, was compatible with human beings having the freedom to decide to do or not to do. In 1913, Twardowski's student Kotarbiński published an essay, The Problem of the Existence of the Future. That's its Polish title. Zagadnienie istnienia przyszłości. And in this essay, he claimed that if, for example, I were to freely decide tomorrow to have tea rather than coffee with breakfast, then the statement, tomorrow I will have tea for breakfast, is now neither true nor false. Only after I have freely decided and acted does the statement, the tenseless statement, Simons has tea for breakfast on 13th of February 2026, become true, and it then remains true ever after. Kotarbiński's friend and fellow Twardowski doctor Stanisław Leśniewski disagreed and wrote a paper rebutting Kotarbiński's claim. Its title, Czy prawda jest tylko wieczna, czy też wieczna I odwieczna, is difficult to translate in English, and I don't like any of the translations in print. What I would say is, I would call it, is truth just forever, or both forever and also since forever? Leśniewski argues, with his trademark precision and attention to detail, that Kotarbiński fails to establish that free will and truth value determinacy for predictions are incompatible. His arguments, which I haven't got time to go into here, convinced Kotarbiński to change his mind and revert to bivalence for future contingent propositions or statements. It would be interesting someday, maybe even by me, to compare Leśniewski's arguments with those of Occam and Buridan, who came to a similar conclusion in the 14th century. So any bright master students, put them on that. Łukasiewicz pondered the same question between around 1917, maybe earlier, when a professor at the newly restored University of Warsaw, and in 1919, after serving in government and being reappointed at the University of Warsaw. Unlike Kotarbiński and Leśniewski, he endorsed the idea, which he claimed was in Aristotle, that's debatable, that sentences about the undetermined future are neither true nor false. But he went a step further, and that step was to introduce a third truth value, which he called possibility, możliwość. Sentences about the open future are neither true nor false, but possible. Nowadays, we treat this move with a shrug of the shoulders, but it was revolutionary at the time and constitutes Łukasiewicz's single most important contribution to the philosophy of logic. True to his understanding of the nature of logic, which he said was all about the truth values and nothing else, Łukasiewicz provided truth tables for the propositional connectors, thereby starting a wholly new sub-branch, many-valued logic, to which, besides himself, others in the school, such as Mordechai Weisberg and Alfred Tarski, made contributions. And I'll just draw your attention in the truth table for implication, where the antecedents on the left and the consequences at the top, to the middle truth value there. If P and Q are both possible, that is neutral in truth value, then P implies Q is true. It may be that this entry in the truth table gave Łukasiewicz some trouble, because he claimed later that his ideas of 1917, which didn't appear in print, differed slightly from those of 1919, and it may have been this truth value which caused him to change his mind. We'll see this truth value gives him a lot of trouble later on. So Łukasiewicz departs from Twardowski's insistence on the absoluteness of truth. A sentence such as, John meets Paul in the Old Town Square in Warsaw at noon on the 2nd of October 1922 is true or false at that time and forever after, depending on whether they did or did not meet there and then. But in advance of the meeting, or at least of the meeting or non-meeting becoming causally inevitable, it's neither true nor false. So he, yet in another sense, Łukasiewicz remains largely faithful to Twardowski. At any time at which it has any of these three truth values, a sentence has that value independently of any other factor, such as place. Łukasiewicz did not later go on, as did his great admirer Arthur Prior, to develop a logic of tensed statements. In his 1922 rectoral address on determinism, which remained unpublished until 1961, Łukasiewicz, at the end of his arguments for the third value, toys with the idea, I think mistakenly, that sentences about the past, describing events which leave no present causal traces, may revert to the third truth value, having been true or false at some time past. For the record, I consider Łukasiewicz's reasoning throughout to be flawed and Leśniewski to be correct. Soon, Łukasiewicz generalized the idea of many-valued systems from 3 to n values for all n greater than 2, and even to infinite-valued systems. And here are the truth conditions for infinite-valued logic, which came out in 1922. For the rest of his life, and in defiance of strong counter-arguments by Tarski and Reichenbach, Łukasiewicz entertained the hope that his infinite-valued systems could serve to formalize probability theory. This they emphatically could not, because, like all his systems, they were extensional, which probability is not. So, for example, suppose that the proposition P is one which has probability 0.5, it's half true and half false, then by the truth table, so does its negation. And therefore, by the truth table for conjunction, the proposition P and not P has the minimum of the truth values 1/2 and 1/2. So the contradiction P and non-P is half true, and dually the disjunction P or not P is also half true. And that certainly goes against not only our intuitions about those truth values, but against standard probability theory. So in 1930, Łukasiewicz declared that of all the many valued systems, only those with 3 and those with infinitely many values are of philosophical significance. So, for example, 27 valued logic is not philosophically significant. The third value represents possibility, and the infinitely many values represent different degrees of possibility. And in this, he was, whether knowingly or inadvertently, echoing a similar opinion adopted without the logic by Meinong in his mammoth volume Über Möglichkeit und Wahrscheinlichkeit of 1915, a work which was likely gestating when Łukasiewicz visited Graz. Now, as we'll later see, Łukasiewicz was to revise his opinion, and we'll come to that. Next, we come to Leśniewski. First of all, in his early writings, including his critique of Kotarbiński, Leśniewski held to the subject-predicate analysis of basic propositions, and in this he was probably influenced by John Stuart Mill, whom he had read. According to this, a sentence of the form S is P is true if and only if the subject term S denotes an object, I should say a single object, which has a property connoted by the predicate term. Soon, however, within less than 10 years, Leśniewski got rid of connotation from his analysis and in fact repudiated all of his earlier writings. In its place, he held that a sub-sentence of the form A is B, which has a so-called official transcription as epsilon brackets AB close brackets, and the brackets are curly brackets. He held that a sentence of that form is true if and only if the subject A denotes a single object and the second term B denotes this object and often, not always, other objects. So A is one object among those denoted by B, which may also denote just A or is more likely to denote A and other things. In this, he certainly unwittingly repeated the analysis put forward nearly 600 years earlier by William of Ockham in the Summa Logicae, the sole difference being that Ockham held that such predications are significantly tensed, which Leśniewski did not. Somewhat later, Peter Geach accused Leśniewski, though not by name, he simply spoke of Polish logicians, of subscribing to an erroneous and, for Geach, heretical so-called two-name theory of predication. This is wrong and wholly unfair. For Leśniewski, the sentence is of the Phrygian function argument form, as witness the fact that in his official notation, he puts the predicate first, epsilon, meaning yes or is one of, A is one of B. The singular inclusion functor precedes its arguments, like in Frege. Incidentally, Leśniewski, like Łukasiewicz, was one of the very first logicians to significantly appreciate Frege and to rate his work in its precision above that of Russell. Now, and I'll come back to that. The next section on Leśniewski doesn't have its own slide. This is called Leśniewski, Two Antinomies and Their Avoidance. The spur that drove all of Leśniewski's work from 1914 onwards was the question how to avoid the antinomies discovered, and in some cases rediscovered, threatening the foundations of mathematics and logic. Leśniewski first tackled Russell's paradox, which he solved, or rather avoided, by inventing modern formal Mariology in 1916. This solution, according to which the class of all classes which are not members of themselves does not exist, this satisfied him, but practically no one else, for whom the alternative solutions of Russell and Zermelo were preferred. Leśniewski spent most of the rest of his life, sadly short, perfecting the logical systems underlying his Mariology, although he never lost his interest in antinomies. A large posthumous manuscript on the subject was sadly lost during the 1944 Warsaw Rising. More crucial for our subject than Russell's paradox is the paradox of the liar in its various forms, which had been known to medieval and ancient authors. I don't actually know who revived it in the late 19th or early 20th century, but it had been widely discussed in logical circles. More serious than Russell's paradox of classes, it threatened the very notion of truth itself, because the mere existence of sentences like, "What I am now saying is not true," seemed to show that no consistent definition of truth was possible. Indeed, despite more than a century of discussion and a plethora of different suggestions for solution, some of them mathematically highly complex and sophisticated, it is not clear that the problem has still been satisfactorily answered, and there's certainly no consensus about how to solve it. Because Leśniewski did not publish about this question in his lifetime, and because of the loss of his nachlass, we have no detail about how he would have tackled the issue. However, we do have indirect evidence that he discussed aspects of a solution with Tarski, because in the section of Tarski's Big Truth monograph, where he discusses the concept of truth as applied to everyday natural, or as he calls them, colloquial languages, he acknowledges taking from Leśniewski both the formulation of the liar paradox and the treatment of quotation mark names of expressions. Leśniewski had always been inconveniently scrupulous about quotation. It's also not unlikely that the important distinction between object language and meta language was a matter of discussion between them. They met regularly to talk about logic. So finally, we come to Tarski, and the first thing we want to know is, well, how is he going to avoid paradoxes? First of all, Tarski outlines the problem of the liar, and he adopts a restriction strategy to avoid it. Up until then, in the 1920s, it had been assumed, because of the liar paradox and various others like Grelling's paradox of heterologicality, that semantic concepts such as denotation, application, truth, and various others could simply not be applied in general because they gave rise to antinomies, to paradoxes. And what Tarski's achievement basically was to convince people that this was not unrestrictedly true. So, since the liar arises through a language deploying a predicate is true, applying to names of its own sentences, a language for which truth is to be defined, nowadays known as the object language, I think that terminology is due to Carnap, not Tarski, will not contain a truth predicate or other semantic predicates such as denote, or be able to form terms denoting its own sentences. Such resources will, however, be available in the language in which truth is defined for the object language, which is the meta language, and that is a term due to Tarski. This will contain means for denoting every sentence of the object language, a truth predicate applicable to sentences of the object language, and finally, the means to express in its own language a sentence synonymous with any sentence of the object language. That is to say, every sentence of the object shall have its translation or a translation in the meta language. And these restrictions, firstly, are jointly sufficient to prevent semantic paradoxes from arising. But secondly, they allow a definition of truth, which is the main point of Tarski's paper to provide. Tarski deliberately confined his analysis to formalized languages, that is, languages with precise grammatical rules. This ensured that there is a determinate answer in all cases to whether a given string of symbols is or is not a sentence. This is not always clear in natural languages, which are, of course, very flexible and growing and changing all the time. It also means that contextual elements such as tense and personal pronouns are not present. There would be no context relativity of the sort discussed by Twardowski. Tarski's one fully worked example was the Boolean algebra of classes. Very simple theory, actually. For this case, it was shown that classical bivalence followed, and indications were given, not spelled out in detail, as to how to extend the approach to more complex languages, and probably most famously, how truth could not be defined in this way for complex languages sufficient to express concepts of piano arithmetic. This is an analogue of Gödel's incompleteness theorem, transposed into semantic form. Before leaving this point, it's important to realize that despite some of his opening statements, Tarski was not attempting to give a philosophical analysis of the concept of truth, but a general method for deciding for the types of language envisaged how to determine for a given object language L the extension in its meta-language M of the predicate is a true sentence of the language L. Now we come to this slide. Tarski places two requirements on a theory of truth. One is that it be consistent or formally correct, as he puts it. The other, and more famous, is that it be materially adequate. The latter is expressed in the famous convention T, which requires that every sentence in M of the following form should be a consequence of the theory, a logical consequence. The form is X is a true sentence of L if and only if P, where X is replaced by a name of any sentence of L, and there should be a name for every sentence, and P is replaced by the translation of that sentence into the meta-language M. In other words, it should be synonymous across languages with that of the meta-language. In some cases, the sentence denoted by X just is the sentence P, and the denotation is accomplished by quotation marks. But that's a particular case, and it's not the general case. The requirement of consistency is there to ensure that this condition is not fulfilled vacuously, since any sentence follows from an inconsistency. The term convention, in the original Polish it was umowa, is in my view unfortunate, since it suggests there might be other conventions or agreements or understandings. Really, it's a requirement, a condition on the theory being adequate, which means being in line with the broad correspondence account of truth, which Tarski calls the classical account, as distinct from the pragmatist, or as he calls it, utilitarian account. I think this terminology again comes from Kotarbiński. As Tarski puts it informally, following Kotarbiński, the classical account says, a true sentence is one which expresses that things are thus and so, and things are indeed so. And that's the Polish original from Tarski's paper. I haven't found an exactly similar sentence in Kotarbiński, but there might be one. Much has been written about Convention T, and I'll return at the end to discuss its limitations. But for the purpose at hand, it's wholly unobjectionable. It's only important to realize that Convention T is not, nor does it come close to being, Tarski's actual definition of truth. That is the much more technical, for all X, X is a true sentence of L if and only if X is satisfied by every infinite sequence of objects, that is, objects from the domain of objects that expressions in L can denote. The last part is tacit in Tarski. Now, I don't intend to go into technical details about this definition, but only to mention 2 points. The first is that the notion of satisfaction or fulfillment of an open sentence by objects, which is strictly a finite or infinite sequence of objects, is one which had been discussed in Kazimierz Ajdukiewicz Habilitationsschrift from the methodology of the Deductive Sciences, the methodology nauk dedukcyjnych, 1921. The second point is that the use of sequences requires Tarski to employ mathematical machinery, in this case, a modest amount of set theory, which ensured that his approach to defining truth would be wholly unacceptable to his former teacher, Leśniewski. Additionally, Tarski understood expressions of the object language to be, as we would say, types rather than tokens, or in his understanding, classes of tokens, again, something Leśniewski certainly could not accept. Now, it's known that the latter, namely Leśniewski, was not in agreement with Tarski's definition, not least since he considered that his own logic, that is, logic done properly, already worked with meaningful expressions and formulated sentences which were already true or false. His requirement was that all his theses, axioms, definitions, and theorems should be true, and that a definition of truth along Tarski's lines was both unnecessary, and, as formulated by Tarski, ontologically unacceptably extravagant. Now, post-war Tarskianism. How are we doing? We're fine. Tarski's views had an immediate impact in the 1930s on those who could appreciate his innovations, who, in particular on Carnap, who reoriented his philosophy of logic towards semantics in the 1940s. These were things, of course, which were not available in Poland during the war. They also convinced Popper that truth was a respectable notion, bolstering Popper's eventual extravagant Boltzanian Fregean three-world realism. The influence of Tarski's views in the English-speaking world, even after the 1956 publication of his truth piece, was initially impeded by the long and dampening prevalence of ordinary language philosophy, and it only made itself felt later through commentary in the United States. Meanwhile, Tarski built an enviable cadre of students in Berkeley, among them Robert Vaught, with whom he wrote a 1956 paper relativizing truth to models. Model theory took off as a logico-mathematical discipline. Its roots were not all Tarskian. Earlier work by Löwenheim, Schoolem, Gödel, and others, Robinson, contributed. By this time, the lure of mathematical results had overcome Tarski's nominalistic philosophical scruples, which he tended to voice only outside publications. In the latter part of the 20th century, Tarski's work began to be treated as part of the history of analytic philosophy and, of course, as a crucial part of the history of the school. That's what I'm here for now. I mean, I could say a lot more about the Tarskian, post-Tarskian developments, not only his, but those of the so-called axiomatic theories of truth. And I'm happy to mention one or two things about those in discussion if we have time. The next section is Łukasiewicz 3, Second Thoughts. Łukasiewicz survived the war to emigrate to Ireland, where he revived his lost work on Aristotle, and which had been destroyed during the war, and published the key 1951 book, Aristotle's Syllogistic from the Standpoint of Modern Formal Logic, which proved not only that Aristotle's logic was comparable in rigor with modern formulations, it also proved performatively that he, Łukasiewicz, could write elegantly in three languages, Polish, German, and English. For the second edition of 1957, which he did not live to see in print, he added chapters on the modal syllogistic. And here he took the opportunity to revise his earlier views on possibility. The three-valued logic included the implausible features I mentioned earlier. If a proposition P has the third value, then by the truth tables, both the contradiction P and not P and the disjunction P or not P would both have the same intermediate value, which is highly counterintuitive. Łukasiewicz's solution was to have not one, but two intermediate truth values, satisfying the conditions he believed a modal logic should obey. This he published in a paper called A System of Modal Logic in volume 1 of a new journal, the Journal of Computing Machinery, in 1953. He modestly entitled the system W. The resulting four-valued logic preserved classical logic in its non-modal part, unlike the previous three-valued logic. But the modal theses were extremely strange, defying reasonable interpretation. For example, no sentence of the form necessarily P is even true. That system remains an unexploited anomaly, although it showed remarkable flexibility of mind for somebody of the age of 75 years. In this final section, this is the last section, which is entitled Context, Sensitivity, Truth Bearers, and Absolute Truth Again. In the final section, I wish to record my own response to this amazing array of brilliant contributions to the theory of truth. These people are truly the giants on whose shoulders we stand. To summarize in advance, I totally endorse Twardowski's view that truth and falsity are absolute. However, I reject the move away from mental judgments as truth bearers, or primary truth bearers anyway, in favor of sentences. And I regard Tarski's convention T as suitable only for a narrow class of languages, and these responses are interdependent. Ironically, the first example Tarski gives of an instance of a statement about truth, not the theory, but an instance of a case, is one which is alien to his own theory. It's this: it is snowing, Polish śnieg pada, is true if and only if it is snowy. The problem with this is that the sentence, if it is snowing, does not have a truth value, at least independently of circumstance. It's an indexical sentence, it's got a present tense, and it's related to location. So this is a very bad example. It's the sort of example that would have made Twardowski's beard stand on end, I think. Of course, it's only a preliminary example, and these are allowed to be approximate, but still it's an inexcusable mistake. The sentence, it is snowing, can only be considered true or false as uttered by individuals in specific contexts. In some circumstances, the speaker will speak truly, and in other cases, falsely. And this was precisely what Twardowski argued against. But Twardowski's own assertion that the accompanying judgment contains all the elements necessary to disambiguate what is said is also quite inadequate, and is a very straightforward argument why not. I can perfectly well judge and say truly that it's snowing while not having the slightest idea where I am or what day or time it is. You just need to invent a little story about me being deposited somewhere after sleep or anesthetic, somewhere I know not what, in the middle of a snowstorm. So what matters is not the somehow occult content of my judgment, which, if anything, is less determinate than the sentence says, but the external circumstances of my judging, believing, or uttering. Sentences, especially sentence types, are wholly unable to escape this relativity. And it's notable that post-Tarskian theorists, such as Richard Montague, are perfectly happy to relativize the truth and falsity of sentences to an array of contextual features: place, time, speaker, addressee, possible world. Twardowski's instinct that judgments, being dated mental events, are better suited to play the truth-bearer role is sound. We need to add utterances as public speech acts, as well as beliefs, mental dispositions to assent to or dissent from something. These may all also be truth bearers with slightly differing conditions, but they're all particular items. Some mental, some public. This does not, Pace Łukasiewicz, entail the view that logic is a branch of psychology. There is a perfectly acceptable semantics of utterances, judgments, and beliefs, which is as objective as that of sentences. To cater for the variety of truth bearers while retaining the absoluteness of truth, we need to accept that convention T is appropriate only to a very restricted class of cases, namely those involving timeless and context-free subject matter, as in mathematics and logic, precisely the disciplines to which Tarski initially confined his theory. For the hurly-burly of natural language, we need to be more flexible. And here in this slide are truth conditions for an utterance of, or a judgment that, or a belief that it is snowing. So when is that true? When is a judgment, belief, or utterance true? Answer, well, it depends. But the truth conditions can be given a general formulation, and that occurs with the quantification over persons, places, and times. So for any person S, location L and time t, S is judgment, belief or utterance at time t and in location L, which is expressible by a sentence synonymous with, quote, it is snowing, unquote, is true if and only if it is snowing at t in L, and is false if and only if it is not snowing at t in L. And the thing to note here is that true or false are stated absolutely of that judgment, belief or utterance. They are not relative to anything, although why they're true or false depends on the circumstances in which they are uttered, believed or judged. Secondly, the mention of synonymy, this is something I put in at the last minute. The mention of synonymy allows the analysis to apply to languages and thoughts other than just English, or as some of my American friends say, language. Finally, the form fits the contextual or indexical elements of the case. But for other kinds of circumstance, the analysis will have to vary. And here is a little exercise. State contextual conditions for the absolute truth of what we might call thoughts, utterances, judgments, and beliefs expressible by the following sentences. I'm going to go through these because they're very standard kinds of sentences that you find every day in ordinary language. I love you. Don't find that so often these days, but nice to hear. My daughter is going to marry your nephew. This is a sentence that I actually did once utter, believe it or not, to a bishop in Tunis, who was uncle of my son-in-law, later son-in-law. I was born in London in 1950. That happens to be true. You are taller than me, which, depending on who I am addressing, it may be true, false, or not quite clear. This car is worth more than 10,000 euros, depending on which car I'm ostending at the time. It snowed in Berlin yesterday. I don't know whether it did or not, and I don't really care. It will snow in Warsaw tomorrow. It is snowing in Cortina d'Ampezzo today because I saw it on the television. And finally, one that will warm the cockles of Convention T's adherents' hearts, 23 is a prime number. All of these work, you can give truth conditions for them. It's not a difficult exercise. There is no uniform recipe, and you wouldn't expect one because it's the flexible genius of natural situated human language to be adaptable to all kinds of context. In giving an account of truth for such cases, I would always aim, like Leśniewski or Kotarbiński, to avoid any kind of commitment to abstract entities such as sets, sequences, functions, expression types, etc. It's something I believe can be done, but it's not something I can or will prove here. My last remark, which is perhaps a little less emphatic, concerns the nemesis hanging over any definition or indeed account of truth, the semantic paradoxes. Virtuosic though they are, I consider the many sophisticated mathematical theories attempting to tame or otherwise interpret paradoxes like the liar or Grelling as, just to a fair extent, wasted effort. I mean, they're very beautiful and clever, but do we need them? Tempting though it may seem to suppose that an utterance of what I am now saying is false may be assessed for truth or falsity, I think it turns out not to work. And this goes for the dual truth-teller paradoxes like what I am now saying is true as well. Truth does not gain purchase on very many things. It does not gain purchase on chairs, stars, cats, names, or lots of other things, verbs, prepositions, or utterances of these. And nor then, for logical reasons, does it apply to liar or truth-teller sentences or utterances. Small matter, it applies in a massively wide range of ordinary cases. Whether these can be rigorously delimited as a class or not is a matter for investigation, but that does not impugn the concept of truth for that wide range. Truth is a respectable, indeed humanly indispensable notion, and we owe much of our understanding of its nature to the endeavours of the Lvov-Warsaw School. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Peter, very much for your talk. And now I would like to open the discussion. So if you would like to ask Peter something, please raise your hand, or yeah, I think raising hand will be the best option. If for some reason you are not able to talk, for instance, your microphone is not functioning, you can also type your question to chat, and I will read it afterwards. Okay. Yeah, there seems to me that there's one question. So if you want, if you could ask, please turn on your microphone and ask immediately.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. Hi, Peter. Thank you for the talk. More than a question is a sort of request for a little expansion. In one section slide, whatever you call it, there was this thing that the necessary truth is, at least according to Łukasiewicz in the Irish phase, not true and not false, or I understand you badly. Is notion of modal sentence is rather unorthodox, or I'm misreading what you say or what he said. If you could expand a minute, I would appreciate it.
Okay, I can expand. What you see on the screen there, can you see the screen? Are just truth tables for a couple of extensional connectives. What you don't see, and I haven't put a slide up about it, is truth tables for modal connectives. It is necessary that, it is impossible that, and it is contingent that. For those cases, and there are truth tables for them, fourth valued truth tables, there are in fact two different notions of necessity. It's necessary that P one, and it's necessary one that P, and it's necessary two that P, and similarly dually for it's possible that P. Those truth tables turn out to be such that it is never true that the proposition necessarily 1P is true, or that the proposition necessarily 2P is true. One of them receives the value neutral 1, and the other one receives the value neutral 2. So the truth table goes, I mean, he doesn't use those letters. He uses numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, where 1 is, I think 1 is true, 2 is false, and 3 and 4 are the two intermediate values. And the truth table for necessary 1, I think, goes 2, 2, 4, 4. Is that right? No, sorry, it goes 2, 4, 2, 4. I don't know. You'd have to look at the, there are two places to look. One is the second edition of the Aristotle book, where he does explain his four-valued logic. And the other is his big paper from 1953, A System of Modal Logic. Anyway, the point is that the statement necessarily P in one of its two embodiments, necessarily 1P or necessarily 2P, is never true. And dually, possibly 1P and possibly 2P is never false. So you get some very counterintuitive results. One of the things you don't get, for instance, is the T axiom, if necessarily P, then P. That's simply not, it's not even true in this logic. There's a very good summary of the anomalous features of that four-valued logic in the first edition of Hughes and Cresswell's book, Modal Logic. Or is it just called Modal Logic? Anyway, the first edition, not the second and subsequent editions. The first edition has a long discussion of Łukasiewicz's four-valued system. So although he has two intermediate truth values, N1 and N2, which I think in his notation are 3 and 4, it's the statements necessarily P, whichever version you take, that are not in any case at all true or false. True, sorry, they can be false, but they're not true. So, for example, necessarily P and not necessarily P is genuinely false. Trying to think if there's anything further to say about that. I mean, it's the one person who really spent a lot of time trying to make sense of the four-valued logic as sympathetically as he possibly could was Arthur Prior. And Prior wrote a couple of papers in the 1950s when he was in correspondence with Łukasiewicz. I don't know whether they met personally, in which he argues that the intermediate truth values are to be explained not in terms of a sentence having a single truth value, but in terms of it having a range of truth values, of two possible truth values. And it actually makes a lot of sense about what Łukasiewicz is doing. The advantage or disadvantage of it, as far as Łukasiewicz is concerned, is that under this interpretation, bivalence holds, whereas Łukasiewicz thinks it's absolutely important that bivalence should not hold. So, but if the nearest thing to a sensible interpretation, now I've tried other interpretations and they all fall down somewhere. The nearest thing to a sensible interpretation is one of those papers by Arthur Prior. And it's probably, I may even have given that reference in the Stanford Encyclopedia article on Łukasiewicz, worth having a look. Otherwise, just Google Prior Łukasiewicz.
Thank you.
So,
Thanks.
thank you for the question. Are there any other questions or comments? Maybe I just, as a historian of logic connected to Prior, I would just add that they don't met because Łukasiewicz unfortunately died some month before Prior came to England. But this is just my topic. I'm sorry for it. Anyway, are there any questions to Professor Simons? Oh, that's quite surprising. Seems. Tadeusz, please, floor is yours.
Yes. Can you hear me well?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. So first of all, thank you for the lecture. So I would like to ask you about one thing, which kind of is connected with Twardowski mostly, and the issue is as follows. So you discussed this paper on relative truths, right, from the very beginning of the past century. But I'm kind of wondering, because at some point you made a very clear declaration that you kind of think that this Twardowski's idea that judgments can be treated as truth bearers is a correct idea in a sense, right? A good way to go. And I want to ask you, because as you know, Twardowski later, not around writing this paper, had this action-product distinction in his works. So in a sense, when we think about the notion of judgment and judging, it has at this later point this dual interpretation in terms of acts and in terms of products of acts. And so my question is, in general, what do you think about this distinction in general? And in case of what's your philosophical stance on the distinction? And do you think that the idea of truth bearer is rather applicable to acts or products? Yeah, so that's the question. Thank you.
Okay, good. That's a good question. I wondered if somebody would raise the distinction between acts and products in Twardowski, because it's an important distinction, and it's another one of those that had a lot of consequences throughout the school. Just think of Kotarbiński's praxeology, for example. I mean, just on that particular distinction, my own view, for what it's worth, and I think I've published something on that, is that it's a good distinction for some things and not for others. So in particular for things like, I don't know, making spaghetti carbonara. So the action or act of cooking spaghetti carbonara is an action. An act, it takes such and such an amount of time. And the product is hopefully a nice dish of spaghetti carbonara. So there's an act and a product, and that's straightforward. In the case of mental things like judgments, I don't think that there is a product in that case. I also don't think it applies to certain physical actions. He gives the example of a jump or a dance. And I think that if, say, two people are dancing, say, on ice, like they are in Milan at the moment, there's no difference between the dance and the dancing. They are the same thing. It's an event or a process, if you like. There's not another thing which is produced by the dancing, which is called the dance. I know ordinary language might incline us to speak that way, but I don't think ontologically we need both. And the same goes for judgments. So I think there are acts of judging, which are dated internal mental occurrences. And those are the things which I think are accessible for truth and falsity in context, of course. Now, if you think, suppose let's sort of do a little bit of conjectural reconstruction. Suppose we apply the act-product distinction to Twardowski's 1900 paper, and you say that when he says it's raining, he judges something which is much more complicated than it's raining, and the product of that act of judging, let's say, is something we might call a judgment content, which might be considered as a type rather than a token. I don't care whether it's a type or a token. I don't think there is a such thing, but supposing there is such a thing as the content, is that content going to contain all of the things necessary to disambiguate the judgment, or sorry, to disambiguate the sentence to the extent that it has its truth value absolutely? And my answer is no, and it can't do for the following reason. The reason I gave in the paper, which is that there are circumstances in which you can correctly judge something where your act of judging does not contain enough information to enable you to fully reconstruct the location and the time. You just look out the window and you see it's snowing or raining or whatever the case is, but you've no idea what day it is or what time it is. I mean, you know, that can be induced by vodka and various other things. And if your judgment, if you have no idea, it's not as if that idea is somehow magically inserted into your judgment by being in those circumstances. What is true is that your judgment is true or false because it's made in those circumstances, but that in no way enters the content of your judgment. And therefore it cannot enter, it's no part of the acting, and therefore it's no part of the product. So, yes, the judgment in context is true or false, absolutely. And if you had products of judgment as well as acts of judgment, that would not help you to avoid the problem that some judgments just don't contain the ingredients necessary to disambiguate the sentence univocally. Is that reasonable answer?
Yeah, that sounds interesting. I was just thinking that it's of course just a speculation, because I don't think we can find anything in texts that supports this. But I was thinking that if we make this act-product distinction, then in a sense we might say perhaps that the circumstances or context is somehow contributing to the product in one way or another, to make it something like a content of eternal sentence or something like that. But this is a pure speculation. So well, I think that...
Yeah, go on.
Yeah, but that's the point, that I was thinking that we can have this kind of a theory in general, right? So it's...
It's not a silly idea, and in some respects, I mean, gosh, I haven't read this stuff for decades, but it's not that different from Bauwais-Etchemendy's situation semantics, because they, as it were, try and incorporate aspects of the context into what you might call the speech act. And in this case, you might say, well, it somehow infiltrates the content of the judgment, whether you consider it as act or as product. And probably it's more likely to infiltrate a product because the product is supposedly something external, not mental. So, I mean, you know, it depends on what ontology you want to give yourself to exploit the resources of it to give you an account which retains the idea that the truth or falsity of judgments is something absolute. My own view is that you don't need to do that. If you can somehow incorporate the features into the judgment itself, that's a kind of magic, to quote Queen. And how does it do that? By what mechanisms do the fact that I am located in a certain county get into my head, especially if I don't know which county I'm located in? So yeah, I mean, I think it's a what should we say? It's an option worth exploring. And I'm not quite clear. I haven't gone back and looked at that stuff, but it may well be very similar to what Barwise and Etchemendy were doing in their situation semantics. So that's a parallel to go and look up.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Are there any other questions or comments? Tadeusz, do you have another question?
No, I just have a comment that came to my mind because at some point we discussed this L system, which we see on the slide now, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that there is some kind of recent work by Hayek, I think, that is he's trying to give some interpretation of the system L in some informational theoretical terms, as far as I remember, in one of his papers. So yeah, so I think there is a work like that.
No, I seem to recall you're right. I mean, it's been a while since I read Hayek's stuff, but he's certainly working in the same area, and he is trying to give it some kind of an interpretation. Of course, if it's an epistemic interpretation, everyone in the Lvov-Warsaw School would run in the opposite direction. I don't know. I mean, if somebody can come up with a sensible, let's put it this way, with a sensible interpretation which preserves enough of Łukasiewicz's intuitions about modality and possibility, then good for them. And I will just simply borrow it and, cite them. I'll have to go and check what Hayek said about that. To the extent that I haven't mentioned it suggests, as it were, retrospectively, that I read it and didn't think it was going to do the job, but I may just have been mistaken or sloppy. So I'll have to go and look at what Hayek said. It's which Hayek is that? What's his first name?
Alan Hayek.
Alan Hayek. I thought it was Alan. Yeah. Okay. No, thanks. I'll go and check that out. It may have. Łukasiewicz was a brilliant guy, and as well as being multi-talented in many different areas, not least, we haven't even talked about the history of logic, which, as a modern subject was basically due to him and nobody else. Łukasiewicz was certainly someone to take seriously.
Because I also wrote something like from a historical point of view on the system L. I had to admit that my favorite interpretation came from Kerry Meredith. I'm not sure whether you read his texts.
From who? Sorry, say again.
Kerry Meredith, the students of Łukasiewicz.
Yeah. Oh, Kerry Meredith, yes. The only logician to produce shorter axioms than Łukasiewicz himself. I'll have to check what Kerry Meredith said about that.
There's this joint paper with Pryor, but the most interesting interpretation and continuations of Łukasiewicz's work is actually from Meredith, not from Pryor. There's this first section is from Pryor, and then there's two sections written by Meredith. But the thing is that many stuff that Meredith wrote about the system are unpublished, but they are in Pryor archives, so they are digitalized.
That may explain why I haven't seen it. I mean, I do know there was a joint paper by Pryor and Meredith. Yeah, I'll have to go and check.
From 1965, so it's quite late work. It's the work when Pryor already is doing with temporal logic. But and there's lots of stuff that is unpublished in the archive because Meredith wrote this book, Computation and Speculations, but it was not accepted by Clarendon Press, if I'm right, or something like that. But those things are available on and digitalized. So if you are interested, you can go through them. They're in prior archive.
Okay, the prior archive is where?
It's Peter Erström and David Jacobson and Per Hassler. They care about it. So if you contact them, they will probably give you an access.
Okay. Yeah.
And,
yes.
And if you are near Oxford, the archives, of course, in Balliol, no, Balliol.
Yes, of course.
Bodleian Library. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
So you can. You are in
library.
England, so you can also see the papers in person.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm not traveling at the moment for various reasons, but yes, thank you. I may contact the Danes about that.
They digitize it, so they should.
Yeah, thank you. That's helpful. Yes, I would love to die knowing a decent interpretation of W. Anything else?
There is just in a chat there is thanks from Anna Brozek, and I would like to ask the audience if they have any comments or questions. When we are talking about Hayek, there's also Peter Hayek's paper about system L, but I don't think they provide any interpretations. It's not so sympathetic to the system, as far as I remember. It was written with some other guy. Font was probably his name.
Mm-hmm.
So
these are things for me to chase.
Just to mention the system, if it's still on the screen. I can't see any questions in the comment section, and also there's no one raising their hand. So probably this is all for today. I would like to thank Peter once again. So please, if you could, you can clap your hands or just clap your hands. And before we end the section, I just want to mention that in the project, we don't just have online lectures, but we also organize workshops. 2 workshops already happened. One was on logic in the analytic philosophy of Central Europe, and there was also a workshop on philosophy of science. And now there is open a call for papers for philosophy of language in the analytic philosophy of Warsaw country. So if you are interested in philosophy of language, and in today's talk there were several topics from the philosophy of language, you can contact me, or you can find the call for papers on Phil Papers, or also on other websites. And we will be glad if you could submit your abstract to our workshop and meet us in person in Warsaw in September. Tadeusz, do you want to add something?
No, I just want to say that it is Peter Hayek, not Alan. Alan is a different person. Sorry for this. Just my mistake. Yeah.
Okay. So I think then it's all from us. If you want to see the lecture again, it will be uploaded to our website and also to our YouTube channel. So thank you, Peter, for your excellent talk. Thank you, everybody, for your attendance and for questions and comments. And I hope that we will see each other the next talk that will be in the series. So have a nice evening.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you for questions and for coming.
Thank you.
Okay. Bye, everyone.
So, goodbye. Good
Bye,
evening. Goodbye. Thank you, Peter, for your talk.
Goodbye. Thank you.
Thank you.